Before I start explaining the routing, what I'd like to do is first I'd like to change the application to point to the shell, which means that we need to create a shell component. So let's go back into Visual Studio. I will create a folder named shell, and then underneath that I'll create a view model shell.ts, and it's going to be an empty class. Export class shell, and it'll be an empty view model. Then what I'll do is I'll create a HTML to go with that. Okay, let me save this and then create a shell.html, and inside of that I'm going to just use a HTML template, and then I will use a h1 tag with a value contact manager shell, and then I will tab out. So now that we've created our view model and view, what we need to do is we need to go to the main.ts, and right now it is pointing to the greeter, as you can see. And as soon as I change it to point to my component, which is shell, and it's inside the folder shell, so I had to give shell/shell. And I already explained that if you don't give any extension, it'll automatically load the component, which has its own view and view model. So it shows contact manager shell, but that is not very helpful because it just shows that we changed our application to go to greeter component. Instead of going to greeter component, we changed it to go to the shell. Now let's build the shell. What I'm going to do is I'm going to now bring the shell.ts from my completed application that already has the routes defined. So that will be easier rather than typing the whole thing. So I'm going to just go into my completed application. I'm going to bring the class, and that has the implementation of routing. Okay, so what I would like to do is I'd like to go through what is in there. As you can see, I'm importing two classes, router and router configuration, from Aurelia router. Now I'll switch to the presentation because it has a very nice annotation of each and every property inside my configuration, router configuration map. So let me go there and I'll explain them. Okay, the first one is we define a config.title at line number 7. All it does is it just gives the title, the document title as modern. So that's what we'll see in the browsers tab as the title, document title. And then when the route is a blank route, that is an empty route, we want it to go to the contact manager URL fragment, which is defined down below. So what I mean by empty route is when somebody types localhost colon 9000 slash without any segment, which is a blank, it will match this route, and that will redirect it to the contact manager route. And what that does is it is going to if it is going to redirect it to contact manager route like this. It's going to do hash or pound contact manager, because as you know the client side route will always start with a pound. We can eliminate this pound using the HTML5 push state later, but the push state requires some coordination from the server side. Like if you're using IIS or Node.js, you'll have to set up the appropriate URL rewrite module, so that when you just pass it a server URL, it'll convert them into client URL and redirect them to the client side router. So we'll talk about that in the future parts. So for now, understand that the first property is a route property, which indicates the pattern. The pattern is going to be empty pattern. When it is an empty pattern, go to this redirect property, and then it takes the value from there, and then it redirects the route to the next route, which is the contact manager route. And the first property is a route property, which is a pattern, and it doesn't right now it only has an empty pattern and a very straightforward contact manager and task manager patterns. But you could also use tokens like this contact slash colon ID, which means that right after this contact manager over here, assume that somebody can type something like slash contact /2, which is an ID. That 2 will be mapped to this ID property. Or somebody else could also use a wildcard, something like this. For example, somebody could say, contact star path, which means that the path variable will be taking whatever is in the rest of the segment, and it'll it'll take this token, as well as the token as well as the path, and then it'll pass on to the activate method of a component that is being loaded in its route. So the activate is a lifecycle method, which I'll talk when in one of the future modules, where we'll talk about the lifecycle of a component. There, the activate method is a very important method. So the URL patterns in this screen only talks about simple pattern, but then you can also use tokens and you can also use wildcards. That's what I want you to understand. Then this next property, the name property, is a very important property. It is a unique name, right? If it's a unique name, and you have to have a unique name, because if you really want to generate a client-side URL using router.generate method or using the route-href method, then it should have a name, and the name should be unique. So what does it mean is, instead of you hard coding the URL like #/contact/2 or #/contact manager, what you'll do is you'll use the router.generate, and then you give the name of the route, and then you also give the parameters. So it will generate, Aurelia will generate the routes for you. One of the cool things is, like, if you use the push state, then you don't need to worry about whether the URL should remove the pound or not, because you are not hand coding the URL, rather you are calling the router.generate or the router-href, which requires the route to have a proper name defined. And the third one is an interesting property. It's a module ID, which is the component that will be loaded when the user requests that route from the browser. Then the next one is a nav property. It could be a boolean or it could be a number. If it's a boolean true, then this route config is included in the router's navigation model, which is generally used for generating the nav bars or top menu bars. We'll see about this in the shell. The shell will use a navbar HTML custom component that will leverage this route config. All of these properties, they are of, like, this whole entry. There are like 3 entries. They are of type route config. They're of type route config. Okay, so that's what is the type of the class defined in Aurelia framework. Okay, so the route config will be passed as into this router navigation model, so which can we can enumerate that, and we can generate the dynamic menus or nav bars. But on the other hand, if you don't use a boolean value, and if you use a number, then that will be used to sort the routes. Okay, so the last one that's very interesting for us is title. The title, whatever value you give in the title, will become the document title. So that's the title that will be displayed in the tab of the browser. Okay, there are some optional properties which we are not going to see, but one property that is very interesting is the href property. An href property is an optional property. If you don't specify an href property, whatever the value you give for route, that will become the property for that will become the value for href as well. The href is very important when you are really using this kind of a wildcard. You must specify an href, because you cannot, you have to have the href specified for the wildcard routes. So that those are the main properties. There are some advanced concepts like pipelines, navigation steps, and navigation instructions, and so on, which we'll cover in a later module. Okay, now let's jump into the view of the shell. We talked about the view model of the shell, where we wired the router, and I forgot to mention one important thing. Aurelia is the convention framework, like I said many times. In order for your view model to participate in your in your routing, you must define a method named configure router, which takes 2 parameters. One is of type router configuration, another one is of type router. This is your way, this is Aurelia's way of understanding that this component is participating in routing. Okay, so configure router is the conventions. It's a method that is required. Sorry about that. I should have mentioned that first before I started explaining the route config. So then we'll jump into the view side of the shell. Like like every view model has its own view. The router view is very special because you must define at least an element named router dash view slash router dash view, because that is the element that indicates that this is a router view. So what is special about a router view? We'll talk about that after I explain this shell.html. In line number 2, we have this require from syntax, which we already talked in detail. And here I'm explicitly specifying a .html, which means that it is an HTML only custom element. And that means I could start using it as though it's a custom tag, which we are seeing right down below. There we are using a nav dash bar tag and a slash nav dash bar. And one of the cool things is, even though it's an HTML only custom element, I could still use a custom attribute and then I could bind it to the view model's router property. This router property is coming from shell.ts view model, which we've seen in the previous screen, where we assign this dot router equals the router passed by Aurelia. So that property is what we are binding to the HTML only custom element. And then finally, we are defining a div class page host, which is like a bootstrap container, which has some nice padding and so on. And then in the router view, the place where you have given router view, that's where the component specified in the module ID of the route will be rendered. Okay, so in the next diagram, you'll clearly understand how we are building the navigation bar UI based on this router property that I passed. Like I said, even though it's an HTML only custom element, you could still make this receive the router or bind the router property from the view model using the bindable attribute. So to define a bindable property, you just say bindable equals and then a comma separated list of values. In our case, we only want to bind it to the router property from the shell, which is the parent of navbar. So this is the syntax. And then what we do here at the bottom is where we render the top navigation menu. We use the repeater, which uses repeat.for. But if you notice it, just this part, the for off is ECMAScript 16 standard, but the repeat.for is an Aurelia's specific implementation. So it is using the for off, but it is using a repeater to leverage the ECMAScript syntax. So you navigate the router.navigation property. This navigation property is stuffed with the map that we defined in shell.ts using config.map, and that gets all the properties. Remember, we talked about the href property, we talked about the title property, which are all coming from that. And the isActive is a very interesting property, which means that when somebody hits that URL from the browser, either in the address bar or by clicking a link, that route will become an active route if you request for that. For example, if somebody types localhost 9000 / contact manager, that contact manager route, the first route, will become active. Then what we're doing is we're using that to set up the CSS class style active, which in Bootstrap means highlight that menu item. And then in the next line, we're creating an anchor, and then we are binding the href, which is HTML attribute, and we're using the .bind syntax. And then we're assigning that to row.href. Remember, the row is the variable for each of the router.navigation. It's going to loop through that. So the row.href means the href property. Since I haven't explicitly specified the href property, like I explained, it will take the route properties value. So if you don't give an href, it automatically takes a value from the route property. And similarly, we are using the ECMAScript string interpolation. That's a dollar curly brace syntax. We're using the string interpolation, and then we're using the title property. Remember, we gave two titles. The first title is called contact space manager. The second one is task space manager. So it is taking those values from the route as well. So in the next slide, you'll have a nice diagram that shows, hey, here is my route map that gets passed into the router.navigation property. And what we are doing is we are assigning all of those routers, and then we are setting the router into this.router property. That is what is being bound into this navbar, which is then accessed using this bindable statement. And down below somewhere here, that's where we had this call where it says repeat.for row of router.navigation. The router.navigation is getting all these keys and values from this route config. Okay, so that is the connection between the shell to its shell view and from there it connects to the nav bar custom HTML elements view because it's HTML only custom element. Okay, cool. Now let's go back and then see how to implement them in our application. Okay, so we only brought the shell.ts, which is the view model, and we'll also override this view by copying and pasting the code from the completed system. So this is what I explained so far. So I'm not going to go ahead and explain again. So we already seen this. So now what it means is it is looking when you set the shell as the root component, it's going to come and then it is going to set this as the route and then set this as the route view. But we will have a problem because we're always accessing the application using localhost 9000. Guess what's going to happen? It's going to go redirect it to contact manager, and then the contact manager is going to look for a module named index under the contact manager folder, which we haven't built yet. It's very easy. So what I did was I went ahead and put a dummy index.html and index.ts. So what's going to happen is when it looks for it, at least we'll have a dummy um, view rendered with the name contact manager and a dummy view with the name task manager rendered. So I just created these two folders and the file dummy files, which are going to serve as the entry point from this router. Okay, so let me click save all, and then we'll see nothing is going to happen because the problem is it's going to look for the nav bar. The nav bar is not there, so I need to move the nav bar from my completed application. Like I think I must have deleted it accidentally. It was there, but now I think I must have deleted it accidentally. So it's very easy. We can copy that nav bar HTML from the skeleton navigation application or from the completed application. Either way will work. So let me go into my project folder, and then I'll go to the other folder, and it was in staging, and then I downloaded that skeleton navigation project. If I go into the source, there I should see the navbar. But what I need is I need this navbar under the shell folder. The reason for that is because shell is looking in the same folder. Dot slash means the current directory, the current folder. It's looking for a file named navbar.html. So now if you see, it should be able to load that. Huh. It is so odd that it is not picking up my changes. Let me, okay, we are redirecting this shell to this guy. Okay, sometimes this will do a control if I do. Let's do hard refresh and see if that helps. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just stop this npm and then I'm going to just start again npm start. Let's see if that picks up the changes because sometimes the watch can become a problem. Okay, so because as far as we have done, we've set the shell as the root, and then shell.ts has the routes defined, the routes defined, contact dash manager slash index, and that's been defined here. And similarly, we have a task manager, task index.html and index.ts. So those are all defined, and then the shell has the dependency on navbar, which I copied. So that should also be working. And here we set up everything correctly. So yep. So this is I've noticed this problem when you leave the npm running with the watch. Sometimes the package server doesn't pick up the changes. When things like that happen, just stop and then type npm start again. It'll start working. Okay, so the navbar, like it did, it enumerated the router.navigation property, and then it put the title here, and then the anchor. You can see at the bottom it says localhost 9000 slash contact manager. Similarly, if I click on the task manager, you'll see the URL at the bottom, which is localhost 9000 slash pound slash task manager. This is not hard coded because as you see, the nav bar code actually uses the router bindable property, and then it enumerates that, and then it checks if that is active. If so, see that highlight thing, and that is the is active property. That's what is setting the style. You can inspect it and see. It's very interesting. So we'll just inspect the guy. Okay, so yeah, you can see that active tag. Watch it disappear when you move to the next tag. But come back again, and then that adds the active. That's controlled by this line. Class equals row.is active. The property is Boolean. That means that is the route that you requested. Then you add the active class. Otherwise, you set the blanket. You set the blank style. Okay. Similarly, the href.bind is bound to the href property, and this is bound to row.title. For example, if you really don't want to bind that to the title, and then you want to bind it to the for the name property, you can still do that. But I wouldn't do that in production, but you can still, for the fun, you can do that. Let's see what's going on. Okay, I think the property is not available. It seems to be a blank property, or maybe it is. Let me pick another property. How about we try the module ID? Unless that's being passed into this dot navigation. Nope, seems like those properties are not being passed, so we'll just settle with title. Okay, what we could do is we could go here and then we can change the title value, and let's see if that helps. So we'll put contact dash manager, and then we'll put task dash dash manager, and we'll save this. And as soon as you save this, that route should refresh. And then you'll see this change to contact dash manager, and this become task dash dash manager. So you get the idea. So that's how you build your navigation bar. Okay, now it's time for us to focus on what we want to do in this index.ts. Like I said, I'm not going to focus on task manager because we're not going to build that. We are going to only build the contact manager, and even there, we're not going to build the whole UI. So let us see what we are going to build. Okay. Okay. So building the contact manager mini spa. How are we going to build the contact manager? So first we need to define a model. You will take advantage of the TypeScript's interface, which defines a shape of an object. So in here, I define a shape. By convention, interfaces start with an I, so I call it eye contact. And then I have about 6 properties: an ID, first name, last name, email, phone number, and birth date. I just put together a number property and 4 string properties and a date property. Okay, so let's do that. Let us go ahead and create the iContact.ts because it's an interface. I'm not going to waste my time typing, so let us copy that and put it over here. Okay, so that is defining an interface. But before we do that, before we even start building our application, what I wanted to show you is I wanted to show you the power of the child router. So for example, when somebody requests for the contact manager using localhost 9000 /pound /contact manager, the control comes into the contact manager slash or index. But in index, what I could do is I could again define a configure router method, and I can define the routes that are very specific to my mini spa. So like I said, in Aurelia, you can keep on adding children routers or child routers as we call. So that's what we're going to do. So let me bring in my route specific to this spa. And I am not going to go over because you already know all these properties. In here, what I'm doing is when the control comes into this child route, like this, for example, if it is going to, somebody is going to say localhost 9000 /# contact dash manager. Let me type it in the next line, contact dash manager. So already the control comes to this route, but here there is an empty pattern. That empty pattern is matching this part. That means if you don't specify anything, it's going to ask, hey, go ahead and load the no selection component, which is not there yet, and that's what we are to do. But if somebody defines this pattern like contacts slash 1 or 2, because ID is a number, then we want them to go to this contact detail um, view component, sorry, the contact detail component, which has its own view model and view. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to build the contact detail. Like I said earlier, we are only interested in building the contact list. So I am going to just comment this line out. Okay. In the view, what we will do is we will set up the left pane and the right pane of our application. Okay, so we're going to do a left pane and right pane like this. So I wanted to just get the template as well, the complete markup. So sometimes, Visual Studio Code can be a little bit, because I'm recording and I'm running a lot of other applications. So the system is kind of like a little bit slow. So okay, so this is what I'm doing. I am setting up the child route and the child router view. As you can see, this is all standard Bootstrap stuff, where I'm defining a row and then I'm defining 2 columns. One is a medium column with four medium columns and 8 medium columns, because Bootstrap uses a grid layout that has 12 columns. It divides the screen into 12 columns, and then it's like a grid system. And then I put the first 4. I am just displaying a dummy message called contact list, and for the next 4, I am defining the router view. So whatever the router pattern that you're asking, it is going to render that components, that whatever that component gives, the resultant markup will be rendered here. Okay, so that is what this is going to do. So what I wanted to show you is the finished application, which we already looked at it. This is how the finished application is going to look. So we are only focusing on this side, right? We are only going to build this list component. Okay, that's what we're trying to build in this contact list. So let me go back, and then I will go to the discussion on the model. So that's what we're discussing. But before I do that, we'll uh, like we are setting the left pane and the right pane. The left pane is blank for now. Okay, but if you notice it, the route is looking for something called no selection, which I haven't defined, which I'm going to define right now. So I'm going to create a no selection component, which means it will have its own view and view model. It's going to be an empty one. And the view model, sorry, and the view is going to be a simple template, which is going to just say, please select a contact from the contact list. Okay, I'm going to save all. And what you can do is you can copy the same thing into the task manager, even though we're not going to build it. It's all dummy, messages. So I'm just going to copy them over here as well. And I will copy the view model. Only thing that I want to do is I want to change this to please select a task from task list. Okay, I think that should be good enough. Let us see what it does. Okay, I think the layout has been messed up, so let's go check the layout. I'll go into that index.html under the contact manager. I think this is a typo, and I will just save that. Now we can see that the left hand side will be the detail, the list view, and the right hand side is the detail. We will focus now on how to build the contact list. Okay, so similarly, if you go into the task manager, that's also going to do the same thing. It has to say, okay, let us go back, and then we'll see that index.html also has to have its own routes. So what we can do is we could, for now, you could copy this and we can delete this one and override it, or uh, let's because we are, even though we are not going to build the full-blown application, let's at least set up the template, and then let us set up the structure properly, so we can come back in the next part and finish the implementation of task manager as well. But for now, all that we need is when you navigate, we don't want it to crash, or we don't want it to give an error saying that the route is not found. So just to satisfy the router, we are going to just set up some dummy route. And what we'll do is, in here, we are going to simply change this to task manager, and wherever you see contact, just change it to task, because this is the URL and the route for this application, and the title will be task manager. Similarly, even though this is commented out, what I wanted to do is I wanted to just, when we uncomment, I don't want to get any routing errors. So I will call this, oops, I'll call this tasks, and this is going to be task manager, task detail, and this is going to be called tasks. Okay, so now I think we're all set. So if I go into a contact manager, it's going to display this message, and then it's going to say, please select a contact from contact list. When you go to task manager, it's going to say task list, and please select. Okay, we need to change that message as well. I think what we've done is, we haven't, when we messed up with the index.ts, we forgot to remove those dashes. So let us fix that. Contact manager, we don't want this. This was only done for an experiment. So I'll just save this. And I think in here we have a contact list, so I change it to task list. Okay, now if we can navigate back and forth, it's going to say contact list, please select a contact from the contact list. Task list, please select a task from task list. From this point onwards, we'll not focus on task manager. Let's only focus on contact manager. Okay. Okay, now we need to replace this part with an HTML template that is going to show the list of contacts. Okay, so that is what we're going to focus on now. Okay, first we define the model, which is called iContact, which is an interface. Then what I want to do is I want to define some kind of a service that my view model can call to get all contacts, to perform the CRUD operations: create, read, update, delete. So I am going to create a services folder. Okay, and then what I want to define is another interface that is going to be called as iContact service. Okay, so in that interface, I'm going to define a few methods. Okay, I'm going to close. I'm going to save this. I'm going to close all but this. Okay, so in this interface, as you can see, I imported the eye contact because I need that as one of the parameters here. As you can see in the save method, I want to mention the contact is of type eye contact. That's the beauty of TypeScript. Even though JavaScript is not typed, TypeScript is typed at the compile time, and after it transpiles, it'll remove all these type annotations. Okay, so this is nothing magic. It's all standard CRUD stuff. Get all is kind of like your select star statement. Even though it's a bad thing, you don't want to just get all. You'd rather want to always, get all with a filter, and then you would want to sort it as well. But for this demo, we really don't have to look at the actual aesthetics of the implementation. We'll make this into a robust application eventually by adding the SQL Server backend, by adding the ASP.NET Web API, and then we will make sure that it's not getting all, because it will be insane if you have like 1,000 contacts in your system. You don't want to be rendering all 1,000 contacts in a list view on the left pane. Okay, so for now, since it's only a sample application to start with, we'll use get all method, and then the get method is going to be getting a contact that matches that ID. And then the search is going to be taking a keyword, which is a string property. And for this simple search, what I did was I will only search in the first name and last name properties of the contact. And any keyword that you type, if you find a match in either first name or last name, that contact will be returned. Okay, technically, you can specify a return value like this. Okay, you know, we'll do that later. And the save method is when you make some modifications or when you create a new contact, you have to call the save so that it gets persisted into the backend. And create is when you create a new contact, and delete is also going to take an ID if it matches the ID of a contact, and then it'll delete that contact from the backend. Okay, so since we're not going to build the ASP.NET Core backend, which we'll do in the next section, what I'd like to do is I would like to bring an in-memory implementation of the contact service. So I'm going to define another class called in-memory-contact-service.ts. It's going to be an in-memory version. It's going to be very straightforward. I'll explain you what I'm doing. I'm going to just copy and paste the code from the completed application. Okay, so in here, what we are going to do is we're going to be importing those two interfaces, the iContact and iContact service, because those are required for my definition. And then I'm defining a latency variable because we are going to use an in-memory repository. The calls will be very fast. So I want to introduce a fake delay of 200 milliseconds. That's what I call as a latency. And then I'm defining an ID property, and that's what is being incremented every time somebody calls a get ID method. Is going to give me 0, 1, 2, and so on. And I defined four contacts, which are nothing but my name and my family members, as you can see, and I filled in all the properties of the contact. And the in-memory contact service is an implementation of the interface iContact service. That means it'll look for all these methods and it validate that you have all those methods implemented. Okay, so here I have an is requesting because I'm just faking the ASP I'm faking a REST API call. So is requesting is false. And then what I'm doing is I am going to talk about the get all first because that's what we're going to use to render the list. Okay, so this dot is requesting is true. That means you are requesting a API call over the HTTP, and then we are returning a promise. So this is a ECMAScript 6 promise object, and then it takes one parameter called resolve. That's a callback when the promise is fulfilled, and then when it is success. So then what we are doing is we're going to set the timeout. We're introducing a fake delay of 200 milliseconds, and then inside of that, if you see that all that I'm doing is assigning that contacts the hard-coded value, that four contacts into my results variable, and then I'm calling it resolve. Resolve means it's successful, and then I said the request is done, so requesting is false, and that's it, and it will return a promise. So the client of this in-memory contact service can call the get all, and then they can use the dot then, which is the pattern, asynchronous promise pattern, and then in the then success method they will get this results which is pointing to the contacts, and then they could use that to pass it to their view, and they can loop through that, and again you can use an unordered list, and then you can render them with the full name, and then we can put an anchor, just like how we rendered our navigation bar. We are going to render the contact and then render it vertically. Okay, so that's the get all. And search is a slight variation of get all. Only difference is you pass the keyword. Like I said, we're going to use the filter. The filter property that's also out of the box. ECMAScript 6 implementation will have the filter on array, and what we are doing is we are passing a lambda expression. We are checking, hey, is the keyword in my first name or is the keyword in my last name? If so, then return all those contacts, and then you call the resolve method, and then you say that hey, request is done, and we introduce the fake 200 millisecond delay. So eventually, this will all be replaced with an actual ASP.NET Web API call, and it'll go over HTTP, and then it'll invoke the server-side call, and then bring back the JSON array or JSON result, and then we'll pass it to the other client applications. And finally, this get method is very simple because it's going to just simply say, give me the contact whose ID matches the ID that I pass. And it's as simple as that. And the other methods are not, we are not going to be using all of them. So I mean, if you're interested, you can download the source code and play with it, because I'm going to explain this in the next section of the video. But for this section, these methods are more than enough. Get all, get, and search. Okay, so now we're going to talk about a powerful concept which is called a dependency injection. Okay, so we defined everything. Now, what is DI? Remember we talked about solid principles. Solid is an acronym for single responsibility, open closed, list of substitution, interface segregation, and dependency inversion. These are 5 principles, and we are only interested in the D of solid, which is the dependency inversion principle. Okay, and people will always relate this with IOC, but IOC is just a generic term for a programming style where your framework or runtime controls the program flow, whereas a dependency injection is just a technique that allows loose coupling between components. So some people use it interchangeably. Let us not get into the serious arguments of IOC versus DI. Think of it as IOC is a big term and then DI is a technique underneath that. So on the server side, we have different IOC containers like structure map and inject, artifact, and Unity. People have used the IOC containers in the Java world as well as in the .NET world. On the client side, Aurelia out of the box comes with a DA container. So the Aurelia framework supports a DA container out of the box, and the way we inject anything is using the static inject method like this. In here, and then you can return an array of the instances of classes that you want to inject. So in here we defined a view model. This view model is depending on an instance of this service. So instead of you declaring a var my service var m equals new my service, you are using the dependency injection to return an instance automatically, and Aurelia will supply you the instance. And if you use transpilers like Babel or TypeScript, you can also use this cool decorator syntax called @inject. So you import that and then you call @inject, and you can inject any number of classes you want, and every one of those instances will be passed to the constructor. In here again I made a mistake because it should have been my service. It's not my view model because you're passing the my service. And one thing that you have to be careful about is if you're injecting more than one service, like for example my service 1, my service 2, you need to have a matching constructor parameters that are going to be taking the instance of those. So here let us do it for the kicks. So let's assume that I'm having an @inject of my service 1 and my service 2. Then my constructor will be over here inside of the constructor parenthesis. What I will have is I'll have a variable. I'll call it MSV1. It's of type my service 1, and MSV2 of type my SV2. So that is the convention. So Aurelia, if you mention this declaration of @inject and then the names of the classes that you want to inject, you will have to have a matching constructor parameters. So this will match this and this will match this. So you get the instance automatically without you having to explicitly instantiate. That is the power of dependency injection. Okay, now let's create the contact list component. As you can see, I've told this many times, and by now you should be remembering that a component is always a combination of a view model and a view. A view model is a TypeScript file or a JavaScript file, and a view is usually HTML file. So these two combine together, and then they interact with each other using the binding syntax, and then generate this beautiful user interface. Okay, so let's create the contact list view model. In our contact list view model, I'm only going to focus on 2 methods. Only is the created hook. It's called a hook. I'll tell you why it's called a hook because in the component lifecycle, this is a very important method because when after the constructor Aurelia by convention, it'll look for the hooks. If any of those hook methods are defined, it'll invoke them automatically. And then the first one is the created method. As you can see, what we are doing here is we are we're calling our service, which is injected using the @inject syntax. Like I said, we're injecting 2 classes, router and in-memory contact service, which means they have to have a matching parameters in the constructor. So one is stored in the router, another one is stored in the contact service. And as you know, in TypeScript, you don't even have to say this dot router. If you use the private, it's called constructor parameter syntax. If you say private, or public, or protected, and then the name of the property, you don't have to define a property here, and then later you have to say this dot property equals the incoming argument. You don't have to do that. This becomes the property of the class automatically, kind of like an automatic property if you want to think that way. So you're calling the get all method. Like I said, get all is returning a promise even though it's a dummy promise that's just simulating a 200 millisecond and then returning an in-memory structure, it's still a promise. And then you're calling dot then, which is the success method, and then you're assigning, you're going to get the value returned from the promise, which is the contacts array, and you're assigning that into this field of this class. So you call the service and you assign the return value into this field. And you must have guessed by now, search is going to call the dot search method, and whatever you type in the UI will see the view quickly, and that is going to be passive. It checks if there's any keyword that the user typed. If so, call the search method, pass the search, and that's also going to return an array of contacts if the keyword is matched. Then you assign that to your contacts, which means you're filtering you're the same property, the same field is being filtered this time. And this selected ID is to indicate the current selection, because when you have a list of contacts, when we build the contact list, how do I know what is the active contact that is being selected by the user? So that is what is the selected ID, which gives the ID of the contact that is being selected by the user using the mouse or by the keyboard or whatever. Then after the search result is returned, we check if that is not null, and if the length is greater than 0, that means there's at least one such result being returned. We always assign the first contact's ID as the selected ID, and that helper method select is defined right here. Even though this is only useful when we really build the contact detail user interface, but for now you understand that this function sets the active or the selected contact ID. Okay, so let's jump into the view. The view is interesting because it has two parts. Like I said, the top part is a search bar, and that's what this area is all about. So here is where I'm building that search component. Over here, this part is all about search box. Okay, so we are defining an input class, and then we're using a value.bind to keyword, which means that whatever you type in that search box is going to be passed to the view model, because it's a two-way binding. So whatever you type in this text box of the search text will be bound to the keyword property in my view model. Similarly, if you change something in the view model, that's going to be immediately rendered into my text box. It's a two-way binding. And here we use the input.delegate, which we already talked about. See, this is the HTML attribute, and we are using the bind for two-way binding. Here is the event, which is called the input event. That means for every keystroke that you type, you call the delegate. But if you notice it, I'm using an interesting concept called binding behavior. So what I'll do is I am going to show you the binding behavior, which is called debounce. The debounce is an interesting binding behavior, which tells me that debounce colon 500 means that if the user keeps on typing and then he stops typing for half a second, then you fire this search method. So one of the things about the binding is the binding will happen instantaneously, right? So when something changes in the view or view model, and if it's a two-way binding, they're going to keep on communicating. You don't want that kind of a the performance problem when you are dealing with UIs like search box, because you really don't want, for every keystroke, you don't want to be calling the backend to filter my data, or even the client-side service which has an in-memory data. It's going to still take a big performance hit. So what we want to do is we want to introduce the binding behaviors that will constrain as to when the binding should happen. That's exactly what the binding behavior is all about. There are quite a few binding behaviors. We are only interested in debounce for now, and that I already explained that if the user is keep on typing and then if he stops for that interval, it's going to fire that method. So that is denoted with this ampersand symbol. So ampersand followed by the name of the binding behavior colon the parameter. In the next one, we have a button which is kind of like the magnifier button, and there you're directly saying that whenever that is clicked, call this search because that's in the user's control. User can click on that whenever he wants. This is controlled by the input event, which is kind of like when your key depress, for every key depress, it is going to fire, and that's going to be constrained by this. But this one is an explicit event firing. And in here, this code by now will be very familiar to you because this is what we did in navbar as well. In here, we use a repeater and we are enumerating all the contacts array for each contact of contacts. That's kind of like the C# style of syntax. When I said for each by mistake. In ECMAScript, it is for off. For the property of the view model properties property, then you're checking. We are using a special syntax called $parent. The $parent is another way of accessing the view model. But the new documentation says that it is an optional property. That means even if you don't say $parent, if you just say selected ID, as long as the view model has a selected ID property, that will be resolved. And here we are checking, is this contact the one that is being selected? Because we know in the previous slide I told that every time somebody clicks on a contact, we set that selected ID to the ID of that contact. So if that is there, then we'll show the active, which means that that contact will be highlighted. It's the same syntax that we did there in navbar. We check for the isActive property of the router navigation property. Here we are checking for the selected ID of the view model. And then this is the route-href. If you remember, I told you that the significance of the name property in the route config is to participate in route in the URL generation. The route-href is a custom attribute that takes the first parameter of route, which is the contact, which means that you need to have a route config with the name contacts, and then it binds the parameters to that ID. So technically you're constructing the URL that is going to look like this. Contacts, and the parameters is ID colon so ID, so it's going to be like 2 if that ID happens to be 2 or 1 or whatever is the ID of the contact. So instead of you constructing this, you are using the route-href. Technically it is going to be a fully qualified URL, which means it's going to be localhost 9000 slash pound slash contact slash the ID of the contact. And on the click event of that anchor, we are calling the select method. If you remember the previous page where we had the select method in the view model, that's just setting the contact, and then it sets the selected ID to that selected contact's ID. And in here, we have done some interesting check. If the contact at first name and contact at last name are present, then if they are not present, that means it's a new contact, so we cannot have the full name, we call it new contact. But on the other hand, if the first name and last name are present, then you concatenate them by saying contact at first name plus with a space and a contact dot last name. And the last one is just a string interpolation. It's a content inside a p tag, paragraph tag. We are just saying contact dot email. So that is the contact list and contact list view. Let's go back to our application now, and then we will build them. So we are going to create a view model contact-list.ts and a view that's called contact-list.html. And we're going to copy and paste it from the completed application, which I already explained. So let me save all and close all the unwanted. Oops, by mistake I pasted the HTML into the TS. So I'm going to go into the TS and copy that, and we will close everything. We'll just save all, and we will go to the contact list. We'll say close others. Then we'll copy the contact list markup. That's all standard bootstrap markup, which I already explained. So now we should be able to see the contact list being rendered on the left side. It's still not rendered. Looks like again it's the same problem today. The Webpack dev server is really acting up. So what we'll do is we'll simply go there and then stop and start. Sorry about that. Usually it is very good. I think because of the video recording or something, there's some latency or it's not picking up that changes. The dash dash watch is not working. Oh, I think this is my mistake. It's nothing to do with because I haven't wired the contact list at all. Then how would it render, right? So that's my problem, my bad. Okay, so in here, remember I had a hard-coded contact list div. What I wanted to do is, if you remember, we can bring in any component, any view resource using require from, and then we need to mention the path. Since it's in the same folder, I'm going to use a dot slash, and I am interested in contact list. Now we have to be very careful. You cannot give .html because this is a full-blown component which has its own view model and view, because it has its .html and .ts. So by doing that, we are bringing in the we're importing the contact list. And again, like I told you, anything can be treated as though it is a custom element. You don't have to specifically say contact list custom element, because that's what Aurelia's default behavior is. So replace this div with contact dash list as though you built your own custom element, because it's a valid usage. And then you don't need this anymore, because this is going to be filled, this content is going to be filled with the value from this template and from this view model. Now if I save all, we should see the list of contacts. Yes, there we go. So we rendered the search and the list of contacts. So when you click on them, see that's highlighted, because that's because of the Sec2, not the Sec2, the selected ID property that's being set correctly. Okay, so now let us do a search. As you can see, all of the contacts have the name, the three of them has the name Raja. So I'm going to type RAJA and wait for like half second. Boom, it called the search method and we are getting the value. Now I clear this. Boom, it's going to bring everything back. Okay, now I type MA, it's going to bring only two, because in my name, my last name had MA and Mahati Raja has MA there as well. Similarly, if I type RA, which is weird, because almost all of the contacts have RA in either their first name or last name. Well, you got the idea. But on the other hand, if I don't want this debounce to work, I could click myself explicitly. Okay, so I can type something and I can click explicitly. Okay, so that concludes this section. So in this section, what we have done is we have built the left pane, which is called the contact list pane of the application. So in the next section of this part, we will build the contact details. We'll also build those two command buttons that said remove contact and add contact, because remove doesn't require any interaction with the details form, but then the add will require an empty form. Technically, what we want is we wanted to be able to display a form that can have a HTML form element rendered for each of these fields. That's it for this section of part 5. Until we meet in the next section, happy coding.